This is episode 279 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, Wally, another week and another series of changes to our COVID rules per the governor. And quite frankly, as somebody who's been pushing for the last year to get more opening, I'm pretty happy with a lot of what's happening and where things are going, and definitely want to hear your thoughts as well. But Hinkle Family Fun Center, Cliffs, Albuquerque Isotopes, they are well on their way to reopening, albeit at lower than normal capacities. Bars and clubs will be available at the newly created turquoise level. And movie theaters, entertainment centers, other indoor activities can open at 25% capacity in the green level. So some good things going on in general with regard to COVID-19 in the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, without a doubt, there is a lot of good going on. You would have thought the red, yellow, green system was the be all and end all. We now have turquoise, and get ready for another color, Paul, because turquoise doesn't get us to. That's not the level before
close.
Things go away. So I don't know. It's almost like club level membership levels. Once you start off at gold, platinum, diamond, double diamond, I don't know where we go from here from the color. We certainly have teal, mauve, and puce to go, but I'm not sure. At some point, maybe before we get to that, it'll be as like, hey, now's just the time to say there aren't these strict regulations. We're just going to have high level policy where, we want you to do things, but things can be open. So hopefully we are close to that. And boy, if you're a Hinkle Family Fun Center or if you're a bar, I bet these are bright spots. It's going to take a while for you to recover, but you're not recovering when you're closed down. And if you can't make any money doing any business at all, that's for sure.
No doubt about it. And I unfortunately agree with you that turquoise may not be the total plateau of levels here. And
well, maybe we ought to have a game on the on our Facebook. What's the next color beyond turquoise? So is it cherry and turquoise like UNM? I don't know.
Well, as a fan of the show, Whose Line Is It Anyway? British, then British and American. Everything's made up and the points don't matter. That is kind of the mode that we are under with regard to our governor and her approach to reopening. Now, obviously, I'm happier. More things are being reopened. This is all to the good. But it also does provide her an excuse to keep us under some form of an emergency order for a very long time. And, we're still under a universal mask mandate. It's one that a lot of people do not adhere to when they're outside walking around or exercising. You see plenty of people out jogging by themselves with a mask on, which I think is insane, quite frankly. But you see a fair number of people outside without it. Now, of course, you go inside in a big box store or another store, including walking to your table in the restaurant, where you then go immediately take off the mask and sit down and have a bite to eat and talk to people. There's all kinds of little nuances there, but it just seems like there's no end in sight for the governor and her emergency orders. And by the way, she said that she would veto any legislation that restricted her authority on this and other emergency orders, which means that HJR 6, again, bipartisan constitutional amendment, Damon Eli, a Democrat, Greg Nybert, a Republican, that is the only avenue forward, assuming that there is a gubernatorial veto. Obviously, you can override at some point, but constitutional amendment at least avoids governor's veto and sends it to the vote of the people, but not till next November. So really, we're under the governor's thumb for as long as she chooses to keep us under that thumb.
Yes, and that is an interesting part of New Mexico law. Unlike California, that has they can put things on the ballot quite easily. In New Mexico, it has to be a constitutional amendment. But the key for New Mexico is that it doesn't need to go through the governor. So it's a way to bypass the governor on things. But you're right; it takes a long time. Now, I think that it may be harder to actually pass a legislative provision that would reduce the governor's provision, that would have to be signed by the governor. It may be harder to get that passed than it would be to override it if it was vetoed. It's an interesting thing because a lot of it boils down to partisan politics, and it's and let's be honest here, this is a Democrat, both houses of the legislature, the governor's a Democrat, most of these Supreme Court justices are Democrats. And so this is a Democrat issue. And so it's theirs to handle. This is the sort of public fight that they really try to avoid at all costs. So yeah, I don't think there's a strong likelihood of anything hitting her desk, period. And if it does, could it be overwritten? Very, very doubtful. And so then we're back to that constitutional amendment and a long time for that. And then in the meantime, what will happen? One of the things I would say is that in spite of the fact that the governor has been extremely strong in terms of her lockdown provisions and keeping her thumb on the very minute details, she hasn't suffered the pushback of other governors, like the governor of Michigan, Cuomo in New York, the governor of California. She has yet to feel that pain. And so unless and until she does that, maybe maybe we have a whole new color spectrum or a new color wheel that will be with us for another year or two. Boy, sure seems like at some point we can just say, okay, just stay away from each other, avoid tight spaces, and let's go back to business as usual, or if not as usual, let's be adults about it, and let's use common sense and let the people decide for themselves what makes sense for them.
Come on, Wally.
No, I think it could happen, Paul.
Let's get real here.
Well, we're doing that in law enforcement. You decide if you're guilty or not, or if what you're doing is a crime. So, but not in the case of COVID.
So every county except for Doña Ana, Eddy, McKinley, and Otero counties are out of the red level. That's good news. Very unfortunate for Doña Ana County, where they slipped back into red after being in yellow.
And just for testing, if I'm not mistaken, so one of the things is that the percentage of your tests that are positive. Well, guess what? This is math. You can fall out if only sick people are getting tested. You can fall afoul of that. And so I know that they're concerned about that. I've heard rumblings out of San Juan County as well, encouraging people to get tests who know they don't have it. Because why? Well, because if you don't, we're going to be back into the bad color and not have our economies open up.
No doubt about it. And that is something that I know is happening across the state. And there's actually been conversations, a bit of debate between the governor and some of the leading health professionals over whether people who don't think they are sick should get tested and what benefits that may or may not hold. Obviously, some people who are perfectly healthy do need to get tested for various reasons, and it's a real challenge in terms of whether this is good data or bad data. Most of the state is in the yellow, including right here in Bernalillo County, and I just hope and pray that we remain in the yellow at least, and maybe in the green. And there's even a few counties up in that rarefied air of turquoise. Obviously, they're not completely out of the woods yet in terms of the governor's orders. There's still a lot of restrictions, even in turquoise.
The other issue about testing, Paul, and I think I mentioned this before, but briefly, there's when things were hot and heavy and there's a lot of infection out there, the healthcare organizations were giving the rapid tests with basically no qualifications. Come on by and get them. There's been pushback now amongst, are you asymptomatic? No, we're not going to give you the fast test. Maybe you should do the saliva mail-in test. And so, the whole thing about we're managing this by the data, well, how the data is collected and what the incentives are and what the process is continually changes. So maybe we'll get away from the percent positive tests. If somebody's looking at that, please look at that, because that may not be as good of an indicator anymore if, the percentages are going down and the only people who are easily getting the test and quickly getting them are those who have symptoms. Whereas before, everyone was like, if you had a tickle in your throat, I got to go in and get it. That's not the case anymore.
Yes. And we are now also tracking, and not alone, school reopening at the Rio Grande Foundation, our errorsoфenchantment.com. We're tracking districts within New Mexico, but a national website called Burbio, Burbio, this data is available over at errorsoфenchantment.com, is tracking states and their reopening of the schools. Not surprisingly, New Mexico, when you factor in, say, hybrid, which is 50% in person, 50% virtual, and there are others, and then you've got to look at districts within that. APS, of course, the largest district by far in the state of New Mexico, is not open at all for in-person. How much of New Mexico's schools are open? According to Burbio, it is 21.3%, which lags the nation. We are among the least open states when it comes to education: Maryland, New Mexico, California, and Oregon. Of course, our neighbors are doing quite a bit better. Arizona's at 68.6% open. Utah's at over 90% open. Colorado's at 77% open. Oklahoma 67.5%, and Texas also above 90%. This data I found at the New York Times. Originally, they were the ones that reported it. For all their manifest flaws, the New York Times has been nothing short of heroic in urging educators in the United States to reopen public schools. Of course, that has not been something that we've seen much of here in the land of enchantment, much to our consternation, the consternation of parents, especially here in APS, as well as student athletes. So worth checking that at errorsoфenchantment.com. Very important information.
Yeah, and then I will second to the New York Times. Certainly don't agree with a lot of their editorial comment, but they have put out some really good data consistently over time. And the other, issue related to all of this is even things that are open in New Mexico. We're open for in-person education, but we're not. We're closed. And so for something to be open, it has to be open from end to end. Everyone has to agree. For it to be closed, just one level has to be closed. And in education, it's not as much at the state level, it's at the local district level. So that's creating a, I didn't necessarily see that one coming. I would be the first to say that I thought that when the governor said, okay, in-person education, that's the way we're going to go, I thought all the districts would fall in line very quickly. Not the case at all.
Yeah, speaking of rifts between the governor and folks that you might otherwise put in her political coalition, APS School Board being notable among them. And Wally, the next subject, I love to talk me some UNM, NMSU athletics. We, of course, hearken back to that epic where we recommended maybe that was unwise, too costly for UNM and NMSU to maintain two losing football programs. Instead, they should just merge into one. Now UNM has lost an amazing amount of cash in the last year, $12.4 to $13.8 million deficit. Their erstwhile Aggie coach Paul Weir.
Former Aggie coach.
Yes, who
He was successful when he was an Aggie, but
for that one glorious season there at New Mexico State.
Well, and you know what? He was the recruiter during a lot of their very good years when Menzies
True.
was the coach there. But you know, he would not be the first assistant who would struggle as a head coach. So, but yes, he falls. So
He's
we're gonna have a new Lobo basketball coach. Whether we have a basketball team this fall is another story.
Where they play,
yeah,
et
and where
cetera.
they pay all that exactly. So you know, and I was having this conversation about the challenges that this new coach will face. Is Paul, if you're a high school athlete that is looking at any Mountain West university, you know, or let's say that every Mountain West university gave you a scholarship offer, I think UNM would be last because there's no guarantee that COVID is over and could not come back again. And New Mexico has fared the worst. I think whoever the new coach is going to, boy, are they stepping into a tough job. And then you have to ask yourself, who are they going to get? And, you know, how successful will they be? And then my final thought on this is, you know, we always talk about we want the program to go to the next level. You need to be more specific, Lobo fans, when you say your prayer. And we want it to go up a level because there is always a down level. As bad as this year was, you know, there's no guarantee that this coming season, if and however that unfolds, will be any better. So.
Well, you are self-identified as an Aggie fan, graduate. You're a supporter of their teams. Should Chris Jans be packing his bag for the 3-hour drive north to Albuquerque?
Well, it's a lot like the Gilligan's Island, a 3-hour tour. You know what? If it had gone better the last time they took the Aggie coach out, I think it'd be more likely that UNM would consider that again, as well as Coach Jans. I'm going to make a bold prediction based on nothing other than logic and data and science. Of course, that's what we all base all of our guesses on here on Tipping Point, New Mexico, is that Jans is not the next Lobo coach.
Yeah, I think that's probably for the best, and
For
him, for all involved, yes. And of course, UNM is paying Paul Ware $500,000 to get lost
through a donor.
I'm sure that donor, the New Mexico taxpayer, perhaps. I didn't know I was suddenly a donor, but the real kicker is that they are paying $100,000. They, as in UNM, of the $275,000 that Weir still owes to New Mexico State University. It was kind of a weird pass-through that he had to break his contract with New Mexico State. So UNM essentially paid that on his behalf, and they still owe $100,000. So literally out of one pocket into the other here in New Mexico. That's the way things go. Now, turning our attention to Santa Fe, there's a few big bills that have been moving through the process. I will identify 4 right here. HB 4, the Civil Rights Act. This is Brian Egolf's baby, and some have questioned, I think very justifiably, whether that represents a conflict of interest, because the people who would be able to sue under this Civil Rights Act often could be represented by folks like Egolf as an attorney. HB 20, the mandatory paid sick leave bill, that's passed the House, as has HB 4, I should note. HB 12, marijuana legalization, has passed the House. And the budget, which got a significant amount of bipartisan support. I believe it passed the House with 60 yes votes. HB 2 included pay raises for government employees in New Mexico. And getting back to the issue of teachers getting into the classroom, a great way to, if the legislature really is concerned about getting teachers into the classroom, they should have put a rider on this saying that only teachers who get back into the classroom should get a pay raise. I think that kind of financial incentive would light a fire under some of these waffling teachers who may or may not really want to get into the classroom or may enjoy being on Zoom a little more than the rest of us. Wally, thoughts on any or all of those particular pieces of legislation?
Well, it is interesting. There is always money for more government salaries in New Mexico, not necessarily for other things that probably ought to be considered fantastic investments, like modifying our gross receipts tax so that we have a better, more friendly business environment. And then with regard to Representative Egoff, there was an interesting statement released that, like, was it a conflict of interest? Well, we have a citizen legislature, which I don't know. It seems like conflicts of interest don't exist in citizen legislature. But the comment by a spokesperson was to the effect that, well, unless it's a law, there can't be any conflict of interest. Well, I would think passing the law is part of where a conflict could occur. But if that's not the case, then, we should just go ahead and say, then we don't need ethics panels. We don't need any of this because there is no conflict of interest with regard to New Mexico legislators. It's just a free for all. Now, I will say on its merits, that bill looks pretty bad to me, Paul. For a it's no secret we live here in Albuquerque. The crime problem in Albuquerque has been bad. People are concerned. What happens if our police are further hamstrung with regard? We already have the feds overlooking them. If there's another level, and then I haven't heard as much from Albuquerque, but a lot of the smaller municipalities are very, very concerned that this is going to cause tremendous risk and tremendous damage to their budgets as people sue them under this. And so, the key is if every arrest you make, you get sued. Pretty soon you won't make any arrests. And we've seen in places like Minnesota that did a mini cancel of the police, then decided, wait, maybe that's not such a good idea. Hope we don't have to live through that natural experiment here in New Mexico, but it doesn't look impossible at this point.
Yeah, we've written up at Heirs of Enchantment issues with HB 4, HB 20, of course, mandatory paid sick leave, HB 12, marijuana legalization. We've heard from folks who are more expert than us, such as the Reason Foundation, that generally speaking, that legislation moves in the right direction when it comes to legalization, and we firmly believe that legalization will happen. We've also written up something about the budget and the lost opportunity, the unnecessary increase in spending, and of course, pay. It's close to a 5% budget increase, and it's just amazing. And I believe Crescit Undo, I'm not a real Latin scholar there, Wally, but I do know it says it grows as it goes. And they were certainly talking about the state budget when they came up with that motto.
Yeah, I think they maybe talked about the state itself, but that has certainly turned into, yes, it grows as it goes. And, we do enough of these things that may not grow. That which cannot be sustained indefinitely ceases. And so we may be getting close to that here in New Mexico.
Well, with the Biden administration getting House approval for their $1.9 trillion stimulus and pork barrel spending package, largely devoid of Republican support, and good news, no $15 an hour minimum wage. But if that thing passes the Senate, you're going to see more helicopter money flying over New Mexico in the near future. Perhaps inflation, which already seems to be growing quickly, will also rise more dramatically. I mean, $1.9 trillion, that is just an insane amount of money.
Yeah, and then to add insult to injury, Paul, very small amounts of that are actually truly COVID related.
Sure.
It's just more, you are extremely accurate. I don't even know if it's the COVID and pork bill. It's the pork and COVID bill that's coming out of Washington.
Exactly. But on the legislative front, you can track and find out more about a lot of the bills that we're watching at heirsofenchantment.com. You can also find out how your legislators are voting and what bills are really making their way through the process at our Freedom Index, which is available at riograndefoundation.org. And we have limited time and lots to still talk about, but most notably, it was released this week that Virgin Galactic, the folks operating out of Spaceport America, yet another delay. They won't be doing their test flight until at least May to address some technical issues, according to Space News. And their first space tourist flights will not happen till at least 2022. That's, as always, very optimistic, which means, by deduction, that the facility, which opened to the public on October 18th, 2011, will have been open for at least a decade before we use it for the purpose for which it was intended. And I suspect we will be, if they do 2022 and have manned flights that work out, I would be as shocked as anybody.
Yeah, it's one of those, if you would have bet, every year $2 and double your bet, you would be doing quite well. And there is no end in sight. Paul, I am not cheering against the spaceport. Let me be clear. But, anything that's, it reminds me of The Princess Bride. Inconceivable that it would go on this long. Well, if you're using that word inconceivable, I don't think you know what it means, because it is conceivable. We're a decade into this. We've spent a lot of state taxpayer monies, counties like Doñana and I believe it's Sierra, where TRC have taxed themselves to keep the spaceport going. So there's a lot of people, New Mexicans have put a lot of money into it without really too much impact at this point in the process.
And Wally, you made me do math on my fingers there. If you started out with $2 and then doubled that every year for 10 years, your last year you would make $1,000. And unless they launch in 2022, you could make another, you could double that into $2,000. So I'm very upset that I didn't make that bet, because unlike most of my bets, that would have worked out quite well for me.
Well, and I think I've mentioned this before. I'm sure I have on the podcast. So not to be too redundant, but I have a bet with a colleague about what will happen at the spaceport first is a manned commercial space flight, with somebody, a paying passenger, or a drag race on the runway, because you've got to have to use it for something. And so a drag race is looking pretty good right now, because cars are a well-proven technology, and Virgin Galactic is having its technological problems with its launch platform, to say the least. So.
All right. Well, in Washington, D.C., they used to have a different kind of drag race.
Oh, yes.
Not involving vehicles.
No, these are driving cars on the runway.
Yeah. Deb Haaland had her day days in front of the U.S. Senate, while no vote has been taken, and she is not technically confirmed yet. The fact that Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, the most powerful man in the U.S. Senate at this point, seemingly, he has said he would support her. That means she is her support is her confirmation is a done deal, which sets off a whole range of issues here in New Mexico, not the least of which is a special election in Congressional District 1. I didn't watch all of the Haaland testimony, but she definitely moderated, from what I understand, a lot of her previous rhetoric to be more palatable to the committee. And plus, the fact is, let's be clear, Biden has already taken two of the policies that she is, what I would consider a fairly radical policy, and taken them off the table, or at least gone ahead and adopted them. That is the permitting for the Keystone XL pipeline, as well as a ban on oil and gas permitting on federal lands. Now, there are plenty of policies that she can manipulate and do things that we're not going to like, especially, but those two are already being done by Biden. Certainly, Haaland, is a true believer, even though she tried to dial a little bit of it back.
Yeah, I watched enough of the confirmation hearings in one of the committees to be disappointed with all sides, and went about my business. But yes, I think she will be confirmed, and she has a big job ahead of her for all the energy issues we've talked about. But she will be leading a arguably, this is a tough thing to say. What's the most dysfunctional bureaucracy in the federal government? But parts of Interior certainly are up for that. When comes to Bureau of Indian Affairs, in terms of how Bureau, it is bureaucratic, and there's no one that is happy with that, and she will be, I believe, facing appropriately so a lot of pressure to get some of those bureaucracies functioning better, and we'll see how that happens. In addition to all the energy issues that are going to be so important to New Mexico.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Deb Haaland, as the first Native American head of Interior, Secretary of Interior, certainly understanding the momentous occasion there in terms of a Native American managing those federally owned lands, but also owned by the tribes. There are groups that have done systematic analyses of how to improve conditions on Native American reservations, et cetera. Those go in the exact opposite direction, quite frankly, of Deb Haaland and her political viewpoints. But hopefully her concern, her interest, her receiving, I guess, tremendous support from Native American tribes and communities across our country can lead her to get some progress in those areas. And hopefully when it comes to energy, she has a bit of a change of heart, but we shall see. If you're interested in more about the nexus of federal policy and New Mexico and energy production, I sat down for a virtual meeting this week with Kevin Hassett. He was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Trump. He's now with the National Review Institute, and you can see the discussion of that over at airsoфenchantment.com. It will also be added to the podcast, all the various podcasts in the feed as a special edition, because it is really, I think, a very important discussion for New Mexico, and having an event with Kevin Hassett was a really big feather in our hat. So it was very good to have that conversation about some important issues facing New Mexico, and I know you'll appreciate Kevin's unique perspective.
And the other thing, Paul, the fact that you were on that event. This issue is a big national issue. I don't think we appreciate it in New Mexico. I think in some ways I've seen more national coverage about what impact this will have on the United States than New Mexico has had with regard to what impact will have on New Mexico. And I know we've done it, but boy, I see that this issue comes up time and time again on the news sites across the nation.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is, quite frankly, here in Albuquerque, here in a lot of the more populous areas of the state, there is a woeful ignorance of where the money actually comes from that funds our state, i.e. Southeast New Mexico, the oil and gas patch. And we've also heard over the years a lot of sky is falling kind of rhetoric saying this, that, or the other will actually just have irreparable results on the state budget. And whether it's a fracking ban, which obviously we hope doesn't happen, that's at the state level, could be at the federal level, numerous other public policy ideas that have been floated or discussed, it's never really come to eviscerating the industry from a policy perspective. There's always been some bites taken from the apple by government and their regulatory infrastructure, but it's never really attacked it head on like we're seeing now. And really, the impact is going to be felt as time goes on with regard to Biden's policies here. We've, in other years, including just 2020, seen the roller coaster of prices and that impact on New Mexico. And that's kind of where we've been impacted before, whereas you just never know what's going to happen next in terms of the oil and gas patch. And right now we're in a very good position. We're a low-cost place to do business. We have new supplies that are made available by the fracking process. And as long as the policymakers in Washington and Santa Fe don't screw it up, that money will be flowing to the state, its bottom line, et cetera, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, three main factors that overall impact the oil and gas industry, not only in New Mexico but everywhere else, is the price of the commodity, huge, not in control by any one person or entity. The technology that's used to bring oil out of the ground, and then the other issue is the regulation that is thrust upon the industry. Mm-hmm. So, in the past, we have had really down periods of prices, but they didn't last so long that it cratered the industry in the state or cratered the state's economy. But, and we thought we might have been in for one. This last year, the price of oil got really low, but it's a lot higher than it was. So now where are we? What's the price going to be? What's the technology and what's the regulation? This is probably the biggest regulatory threat that we've seen in a long time. They've done some things around the edges in New Mexico, the so-called pit rule that created some additional costs, but the industry was able to adjust. But if you can't hydraulically fracture wells, you can't drill new wells. That's a big one, and we'll see how much they carry through on that.
No doubt about it. And finally, we are about a year into the whole COVID situation in our state. We're talking less than half of a month at this point before we hit really what I consider to be the year anniversary of COVID and its arrival in New Mexico. That was March 11th. As we record this, it is March the 1st. So we're really getting down to having been under some kind of restrictions for just about a year. And I was contacted by a media outlet, a small media outlet called Downtown Albuquerque News. And they were wondering what's going on with the Rail Runner and what did we think about it? Because, we've been talking about the Rail Runner for a long, long time here. And the Rail Runner hasn't operated since mid-March of 2020. Now, I know some people took it, some people miss it, but it's just astonishing how little interest we've seen from across just the metro area, let alone the state of New Mexico, about the Rail Runner, when it's going to start back, why it shut down for so long in the first place. Amtrak's been operating for the entire cycle, as have most transit outlets or systems across the country. Wally, I know you're a big fan of the Rail Runner. Use it all the time. I'm kidding, of course.
Well, I've used it, I think I'm up to 5 times. And 3 of the experiences were horrible. So that's 2 were great, by the way. If I'm going to be honest. Well, the one time I probably told this story before too. There's a Rail Runner station right by a bunch of state offices, and I had to stay late for a meeting, and my carpool partner needed to go back early. I said, no problem. I will take the Rail Runner. It stops right here. The meeting's over at 5. There's a train at 5:15. This is like a February day. 9:30, the train finally comes there. I almost froze to death waiting for the train in February. So I was like, was not my happiest time. I guess that was I was told that's unusual. Well, it was unusual. But, what strikes me about this time is, Paul, what if you didn't run the train and no one even cared? It's like it took a year for somebody to reach out to you. One of the most vocal critics of the train from an economic, fiscal, and operational point of view. It's just not really an issue. And it's a huge amount of money, but boy, the number of riders comparatively is so low, which has always been the problem with it. And maybe this, do we just forget to open it back up and it quietly goes away? I have a feeling that's not going to be the case, but hope does spring eternal.
No doubt about it. Well, they just did invest, the state and federal governments, $60 million into a system of positive train control. That's something that's supposed to make it less likely that trains crash into each other. So it's unlikely, based on that alone, that you would see a sudden decision to eliminate or pull back on the train, because that is a substantial expenditure of resources. It costs about $30 million annually just to operate between, well, that's cost as in taxpayer subsidies of one type or another. So that is a huge issue. And given our current governor and the legislature, I can't imagine they will be likely to pull the plug, so to speak, on this train. They didn't furlough any of their workers. This is a classic case, talking back about the budget and how all these government employees have been employed for the duration of the crisis, no major impacts to them. I don't know what people who are, quote, working at the rail runner, who are collecting those paychecks, are actually doing on a day-to-day basis. You will occasionally, if you drive up to Santa Fe from Albuquerque or vice versa, you will see empty trains moving along just to keep the train sets working and possibly testing the positive train control. But the fact is that this is just a classic boondoggle that, eventually some significant number of those, you mentioned those state bureaucracy buildings, those will reopen. Will they ever reopen to the kind of 100% occupancy? Now that we've gotten this world of remote meetings and Zoom and people working independently, I'm not convinced. If I was a government worker, I would be first in line to avoid having to catch that train in the early morning hours in Albuquerque and take it all the way up to Santa Fe and come back home. You're talking about, say, 15 minutes minimum to get to a train station in Albuquerque, and then it's an hour and a half to get up to those office buildings. It's a huge waste of time. If you could be working and actually doing your job, you can be so much more productive and not have to ride that wonderful train up to Santa Fe.
Yeah, that is an exceptionally good point, and you've made the point on the podcast as well as guests that the alternatives are not always about, is it a car versus a train? Do we even need to go to an office versus utilization of technology? And if there's one thing that the COVID crisis did, was it did show people what was possible. And in a lot of cases, it was a disaster. I will say that. But in a lot, it's worked quite well and possibly better than the other form where people rode up getting, you have to, the key is an hour and a half ride up and, 15 minutes to get to the train station. Let's go ahead and round that to 2 hours on either side. Maybe you're a more productive employee if you are working at home. If you have a strong work ethic and they can figure out what your job is and what you're supposed to be doing enough to evaluate you anyway. So interesting.
Yeah, and I'll just conclude by saying that in years past legislative sessions, I have indeed taken the train up more than once. It's overall okay as long as you have something to do. You're not relying on their horrendous Wi-Fi. If you're going to do broadband around the state, maybe the rail runner would have been a good starting place to get a decent Wi-Fi system in place. However, even if the train had been going, given the current situation in the roundhouse, I would not have taken it up at all because they didn't meet in person. So anyway, we just thought we'd give you an update because at its time, the rail runner was one of the most important and controversial projects of the Richardson era, right there with that spaceport, which hasn't worked out so well either. And we're just trying to make sure we know where the dollars and cents are going. Money that, as they talk about raising the gas tax, for example, in Santa Fe, that rail runner money would have looked awfully nice refurbishing our roads and doing other more beneficial things than providing for a train system that's really not achieving much of anything at this point.
Yes. System.
Yes. Well, thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnewmexico.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, and have your Google Home device play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.